What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
They told me not to come to the reunion because they did not need dead weight around, and I swear the words landed with that exact casual cruelty people use when they have said this sort of thing before and gotten away with it. So I sat there with the phone in my hand and watched the group chat keep moving, little bubbles of logistics and jokes and photos of centerpieces and a playlist they were building without me, and I felt that familiar tug to explain myself die off because there is a point where defending your place in a family feels like begging for a chair at a table you paid for and set and cleaned and somehow were told you only smudged. I did not respond, not because I was shocked, but because this was not new, just louder, and while my sister typed that line about keeping the vibe positive and my brother dropped a thumbs up like an exclamation point, I remembered the last dozen times I had been invited only as a helper or a ride or a convenient wallet, the little ways they made me useful while reminding me I was not the favorite, not the leader, not the one anyone bragged about. And I could hear my mother's voice from years ago calling me the reliable one like it was a compliment while my father laughed and said that at least I did not make trouble, which is another way of saying I had learned to make myself small. What I am not supposed to say out loud is that small people still carry heavy things, and for the last year the heaviest thing I carried was the quiet secret that my father's business was not just expanding the way he told neighbors at church, it was wobbling. And he had been courting a loan that needed a second name with clean books and an unblemished history, a name that would make the bank relax and say yes without a fight, and because I have always paid what I owe and because I have never thrown a fit, and because I am predictable in a way that makes insurance companies send me cheerful mail. He came to me with a folder and a speech about family and trust and a promise that this time I would be part of something, that this signature would make me more than the odd one out. I said yes at the time because I wanted to believe him, and I wanted to believe that my steadiness had value beyond errands and last-minute favors, and I told myself that if the people who never see you will not look up, sometimes you put something important in their line of sight and they finally do. So I went to the first meeting and I answered the questions and I let the loan officer look me up and down like a ledger. And we picked a date and all that was left was a final signature. Nothing more dramatic than a pen scratching paper. So when the message landed about me being deadweight, I did not send the comeback I wrote in my head or the essay about how you do not get to insult someone and then ask them to bring ice and folding chairs. I just slid the phone face down on the table and sat very still, and it is funny how stillness can feel like an action when you have spent years sprinting to keep up with other people's needs. Because the quiet made a door open in my head and on the other side was a single clean thought. That did not ask for permission. If I am dead weight, then I do not carry your load. I picked up the folder he had left at my place, the one with the sticky note telling me the date and time, and the little thank you smiley face that I could never tell if he meant, and I read the clause I had already read 3 times. The one that said no funds would be released without all signatures confirmed and all parties aligned, which was lawyer talk for you can walk away until you do not, and I realized that for once I was standing in the only doorway that mattered and no one else even remembered I had the key. I did not call the group chat, and I did not call my mother, and I did not call my sister to tell her that a vibe is not a plan. I called the loan officer and left a clear, calm message where I used my full name and the application number and said I needed to place everything on hold until further notice, because I had new information to consider, and my voice did not shake, and I did not overshare. And I did not apologize as if I had spilled something on their nice rug. I simply pressed the kind of pause that grown-ups are allowed to press when the thing at stake has their name stamped on it. After I hung up, I did something small that felt big anyway. I scrolled back through the family chat and muted it, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I wanted to hear my own thoughts for once without the constant low buzz of being measured and found lacking, and in the new quiet, I made myself a promise I had never made before, which was that no decision involving my name would move forward without my belief attached to it, not my fear of being left out, not my hunger for a pat on the head, not my habit of making things easier for people who never noticed. I wish I could tell you I felt instantly triumphant, that a choir started up in the kitchen and the air turned sweet, but what I actually felt was steady and a little sick and very awake. Like when you realize the test is not multiple choice and no one can circle anything for you. And then my phone buzzed in that quick double tap that means a voicemail landed, and then buzzed again and again and again, until the screen was stacked with missed calls from the same number, my father's number. The one I used to answer before the first ring had finished just to prove I was available, and I stared at it and let it ring out because the loan officer had clearly done their job faster than anyone expected. The first message began with him using my full name and ended with "Please call me back right now." The second was rougher around the edges and accused me of misunderstanding. The third softened and said he wished we could talk like adults who care about each other. And I sat there listening and not listening, because underneath every word was the same truth I had been handed in that group chat. Only this time I was the one handing something back, and as the fourth message arrived, the one where his voice dipped in a way I had not heard since I was a kid, I realized something else I had not let myself believe before, which is that power feels quiet on the inside even when it is loud on the outside. And I pressed play, and I let it run. And I decided I would not answer yet, not until I heard what he sounded like when he finally said the part one was waiting to hear. When the missed calls stacked up and the voicemails lined themselves like a row of wagging fingers, I sat with the same folder he had handed me months earlier and walked myself back through how I got roped into the role of dependable signature, remembering how my father, Richard, had sold the expansion as a family victory while describing my participation not as help but as proof that I finally understood what it meant to be a team player, which is convenient language people use when they want your stability without giving you a seat at the table that decides where the team is going. The pitch had not been grand or dramatic, just steady pressure in the shape of errands, meetings, and a lot of borrowed certainty. Because when a bank officer named Mr. Green tells you that your name will make the underwriter relax and your clean history will smooth the last step, you start to believe that maybe this is how acceptance works in families like mine, not through apologies or respect, but through paperwork that needs you, and I could hear the chorus from my mother and siblings at the time saying that it would be good for all of us if I simply signed and stopped overthinking, as though caution were a flaw and not the reason any of them still asked me for rides to the airport and quiet bailouts when a fee posted overnight. I remember how he had called the cosign request a temporary bridge, and how he smiled in that way parents do when they imply that your cooperation is both expected and flattering. And I remember how I carried my statements into the branch like a kid bringing clean shoes to a game she is not sure she will be allowed to play, and how Mr. Green, polite but brisk, looked me over like a ledger and said we were almost there, that in one short appointment we would finalize terms, and that this final step would be a formality, and I nodded because that is what I had trained myself to do whenever a room felt like it had already decided on my role. So when my family decided I was dead weight and the group chat turned into a party I was not invited to plan or attend, I decided to take myself seriously in a way that would have sounded dramatic if I had not had the folder in my hand to back it up. And the first thing I did, after leaving the hold message you already know about, was to draft a clear, simple email to Mr. Green with the subject line stating in plain words that I was withdrawing consent to participate and revoking any prior authorization to use my records or my name for underwriting, and then I printed it, signed it, scanned it, and sent it again so there would be no confusion about intent. Because confusion has always been the fog my family likes to live inside when they do not want to face the plain meaning of how they treat me. I followed that was something I should have done years ago, but did not because I was too busy being agreeable, which was to place a freeze on my credit at all 3 bureaus and to set fraud alerts that would force any lender who touched my file to actually speak to me and to log my verbal confirmation in writing. And even though the calls to those bureaus dragged and the automated voice sounded like a bored receptionist, I stayed on because this time the point was not convenience, it was leverage, and when the confirmation emails chimed I felt a small, private click inside, the kind that says you have just moved a piece on the board other people forgot you owned. I also sent a certified letter to the branch manager whose name I learned when I bothered to read the disclosures no one else at my house ever reads, and in that letter I used the most boring, powerful words I could find, phrases like rescind, revoke, and do not rely, and I attached the earlier email with the timestamp and the delivery receipt so whenever anyone tried to say this was sudden or emotional, the paper would calmly disagree, and because I know how my family behaves when their plans wobble, I added a line stating that any third party attempting to speak on my behalf, including relatives, did not represent me and did not have my authority, which is something I should have said about a dozen holidays ago. The part that surprised me was not how quickly the bank reacted, but how quickly my father did, because within an hour he called, and within another hour he called again, and the messages slid from confidence to annoyance to a kind of weary condescension. The tone fathers use when they think a daughter is being delicate or petty, and I listened without answering, because I wanted to hear if anywhere in his voice there was the admission I had never once been offered, not the word sorry, which I do not need, but the admission that he assumed I would carry the weight without complaint, because I always had. Somewhere between those calls my sister Kelsey texted to say I was making a scene and that this would hurt everyone, and I typed and deleted a paragraph about how a scene is what you create when you remove the backdrop people have been leaning on, but I did not send it, because I was done explaining myself to an audience that never listens unless there is something in it for them, and instead I forwarded all my notices and receipts to my own email again and printed a second set for the folder, so that if anyone ever tried to paint this as impulsive, I could hold up a timeline of calm steps taken in my name by me alone. I kept remembering small humiliations from years that were apparently ordinary in our house, like the time I covered a payment so the utilities would not shut off, and then watched them toast my brother Mark at dinner for landing a discount on tires, as if savings earned a speech, but bills paid on time did not deserve a mention. And while those memories flickered, I recognized that a pattern does not change because you tell it to. A pattern changes because you stop feeding it, and that thought held me steady when the next voicemail arrived and the one after that, each trying a different door into my head. By late afternoon, Mr. Green replied with a brisk message asking me to come in the next morning to sign a short statement for the file and to bring identification so they could formally mark the application as withdrawn. And he wrote that the bank would need to restart the analysis from zero if the borrower attempted to substitute another guarantor, which meant delays and fresh scrutiny and the kind of daylight my father hates. And while I read it, I realized that my signature had always been the quiet hinge holding a very loud door, and without it the door would not swing, no matter how hard he pushed. I ended the day with one more concrete step that felt like not just caution but a form of teaching, which was to log into the shared financial portal where I had once, against my better judgment, granted view access to a family accountant. And I removed it with a simple click, leaving a note for myself that said never again, because the only way to stop being treated like a resource is to stop agreeing to be mined. And when I closed the laptop, the apartment felt the same, but I did not, which is the only kind of change that matters. If you are wondering whether this counted as revenge or just hygiene, I will tell you the truth I did not know I needed until that moment, which is that revenge does not have to be loud or cruel to be devastating. It only has to be precise and undeniable. And as I slid the certified mail receipt into the folder and stacked it on top of the old promises I had finally chosen not to believe, my phone lit up again, and this time it was not a voicemail, but a call from an unknown branch number asking me to confirm a morning appointment, which I accepted, and as I set the alarm for early and turned the ringer to silent, a final message from my father rolled in where he said he hoped I understood what I had done and that I could still fix it if I called before morning, and I let it sit there unopened, because the next thing they were going to hear would not be my explanation. It would be the sound of a pen staying in my hand while the paperwork closed without me. The next morning, I walked into the branch with the same calm I use when I know a conversation will try to shove me into a corner, and I have already decided the walls will not move. And while Mr. Green led me to a small office with a desk that probably had 1,000 signatures baked into it, he explained in that steady bank voice that the statement I was about to sign would mark the application as withdrawn at my request, that my prior authorizations were canceled, and that the bank would notify the borrower their file had reverted to preliminary status, which is a polite way of saying the clock just went back to the starting gun and the track got longer and steeper for anyone who thought my name was a ramp. Before I even uncapped the pen he mentioned, carefully and without choosing a side, that my father had already called the branch twice that morning asking whether there was a mix-up with the daughter. And I appreciated that he said it exactly like that because it reminded me how language turns people into props when they are useful and into problems when they finally speak. So I asked him to add a note to the file that any further contact about my participation should be directed to me only, and that no relative, accountant, or friendly neighbor could speak with authority on my behalf, and he nodded and slid the statement across. And I signed once with a calm hand that did not apologize for existing, and once more on a line that rescinded the release of my records. And when he stamped it, I felt that quiet internal click that tells you a door you did not build has finally been locked from your side. He printed 2 copies, placed one in a folder for me, and then, almost as an afterthought, asked whether I wanted the bank to email a courtesy notice confirming the withdrawal to the address on file. And I said yes because paper trails are what you keep when a family likes to rewrite history at dinner, and as I stood to go he added that if the borrower attempted to substitute another guarantor the underwriting would be reopened, income would be re-verified, and liabilities would be re-evaluated, which is the kind of daylight that makes people who cut corners look for umbrellas, and I thanked him and left before anyone else could step in with a performance about loyalty dressed up as logistics. The missed calls started before I reached the parking lot, my phone vibrating like a trapped bee in my pocket while I walked slowly because speed never helped me think. And the first voicemail came in hot with my father telling me I had embarrassed him and confused the bank and needed to come back in to fix the misunderstanding. The second switching to that tone where he pretends we are partners navigating a minor hiccup. And the third, which landed just as I sat in my car, shifting into a measured disappointment that always used to hook me when I was younger because it sounded responsible and grown, but underneath it was the same expectation that my steadiness belonged to him, not to me. And when my sister Kelsey texted that I was hurting everyone and should stop making a scene, I stared at the words and thought about how women in our family get labeled dramatic for doing anything other than silent labor. I drove home and started another round of very boring, very effective moves, because if there is one thing I know how to do it is turn feelings into paperwork. So I called the supplier credit manager whose name I had noted during one of those late-night tax talks when no one thought I was listening. And I introduced myself with my full name and explained that I would not be guaranteeing any credit lines connected to my father's business now or in the future, that any representation to the contrary was false, and that any document bearing my name without my wet signature should be treated as suspect, and the manager, a man who sounded like he had survived more than one optimistic entrepreneur, thanked me for the clarity and said he would update the account and flag it for manual review if terms changed, which is not drama, it is friction, and people who rely on other people's smoothness hate friction. By early afternoon, the fraud alert I had placed the day before paid off in the most honest way a system ever tells on someone. Because a bureau sent me a notification asking whether I was attempting to open a new revolving account tied to a small business lender whose name I had never heard, and when I tapped to decline, and then dialed the number to confirm it was not me, the representative walked me through adding a PIN that would have to be spoken aloud before anything moved, which meant whoever was trying to slide around me would meet an operator who needed the one thing my family never asks for, my explicit permission. And I sat there with the phone warm against my cheek and thought about how easy it had been for years to confuse kindness with access. A fresh voicemail landed while I was on the line, and when I played it back my father's voice had moved into a new gear where he was suddenly humble and weary and talking about decades of work and what a shame it would be to let a paper mistake stall a meaningful expansion that would benefit all of us. And right there, with the line quiet and the apartment still, he said the sentence that made me sit up, because he admitted that the plan had never included me in any real way, that my role was to make the bank comfortable and then step back while the adults handled the business, which would have been funny if it had not been the exact story of my life. And I saved the message to a folder labeled with the kind of name I would remember if I ever needed a reminder of how I had been spoken about when people thought my value ended at a signature. An hour later my mother called with that voice she reserves for holidays and hospital updates, asking me to call back so we could untangle things before they got messy, and I almost answered because muscle memory is powerful, but I did not. Since answering has always meant agreeing to be the quiet fix in the back room while the men shake hands in the front, and instead I typed a note to myself that said no decisions under pressure, no explanations without respect, and no more pretending that participation equals belonging. And then, as if the day needed one more test, a final voicemail landed where my father said he had found another route through a private lender who could move fast if only I would be reasonable and sign a short-term guarantee for the family's sake, and that if I refused, he would have to put the house on the line, which is the closest he has ever come to saying what he actually values. And I replayed it twice, saved it with the others, and realized that the next move would have to be sharper than a signature withheld, because if he was willing to gamble the roof over my mother's head, then the lesson I was teaching had not yet reached the person who most needed to learn it. By the time the sun slid behind the apartment buildings and turned the living room into that flat gray that makes everything look honest whether you want it to or not, the day had already frayed at the edges with calls I refused to take and messages I refused to dignify, and even though a part of me kept whispering that I was pushing too far and would end up alone with a stack of paperwork and a bruised conscience, the steadier part answered that I had spent most of my life being cooperative to the point of disappearing. So if this looked like drama from the outside, that was only because people prefer their helpers quiet and their boundaries invisible. Kelsey tried the guilt route with a voice note about family unity that somehow used my name only when assigning blame. Mark went practical and asked whether I would at least meet with a private lender his friend knew because the terms were supposedly favorable and the timeline merciful. My mother left a careful message about keeping things nice because people talk and reputations matter, and my father cycled through every register a man learns when he confuses leadership with control, but beneath all of it was a simple fact that none of them wanted to look at directly, which was that their plan only worked if I kept being the same old version of myself who underlined dates, showed up early, and signed whatever made the room stop buzzing. I made tea I did not drink and opened the bottom drawer of my desk where I keep the kind of records everyone teases until they need them. And I pulled the small stack from a year ago when the payroll crisis had hit and the family accountant had called me in the middle of a grocery run asking whether I could float a short loan for a couple of weeks. And I had said yes, but only with something in writing because I was tired of the way favors evaporate when stories get retold, and there it was, a simple promissory note signed by my father with a short paragraph granting a security interest in inventory and receivables until repayment cleared, an agreement so bare it barely breathed and yet still real enough to sit up when the right light hit it. And as I ran my finger along the signature, I remembered how sheepish he had been that afternoon, how quickly the shame had vanished once the funds hit, and how the gratitude never made it into the family narrative. I am not a lawyer. I am just someone who reads what she signs, but I knew enough to know that a security agreement without notice is like a lock without a key. So I checked the state website and learned that a simple filing could put the world on alert that my interest existed, and while a year had passed and the loan had been partially repaid, it had never been closed with a release. And that gap between done and documented is where messes live, so I called an old classmate who now drafts commercial documents for a living and asked 2 questions in a voice so plain it did not invite judgment: whether a filing now would be valid given the agreement already existed, and whether a new lender would have to reckon with it. And she said that while she was not my attorney and could not give formal advice, she could tell me in general terms that public notice changes conversations, that priority and perfection are not just words on a bar exam, and that practicality often follows whatever is easiest to verify. I thanked her, filled out the online form with patient fingers, used the exact legal name of the business, as it appears on tax filings, attached a copy of the agreement to my records even though the site did not require it, paid the modest fee with a card that no one in my family has ever touched, and when the confirmation number appeared I copied it to 3 places and printed the receipt for my folder. Because if I have learned anything, it is that paper is louder than memory at any conference table that matters. Then, while the printer was cooling, I opened a new email and wrote to the private lender my father had hinted at in his last message, not to argue or accuse, but to provide, in that calm, neutral tone lenders actually respect. A short statement that I would not be guaranteeing any obligation, that any document purporting to include my consent should be treated as suspect, and that an existing security interest had been publicly noticed that afternoon. And I closed by inviting them to contact me directly with any questions, which is the kind of sentence that makes reasonable people slow down and unreasonable people show their hands. As soon as I hit send, I forwarded the series of voicemails in which my father used the phrase paper mistake and the line about getting me to sign for the family's sake to the bank's compliance address listed on the disclosures. Not out of spite or a desire to humiliate him, but because words matter when money moves, and I wanted there to be a time-stamped record that the pressure was real and that my withdrawal had come in the middle of a campaign to blur the lines. And once again I wrote in that calm, factual voice that does not hide behind adjectives, because the institution does not care how you feel, it cares what you can prove. The next call did not come from a relative, it came from a number I did not recognize that announced itself as the lending officer from the private firm, and when I let it roll to voicemail, he left a tidy message acknowledging my note, confirming they had paused processing, and asking me to return the call if I would like to clarify any details, which told me everything I needed to know about whether my message had landed. Meanwhile, my phone chirped with a text from Mark saying I had just made things complicated for no reason and that if I wanted to be included this was a strange way to show it, and I stared at the word included for a long time because it revealed how they understood belonging, as a reward for compliance, not as a recognition of worth. I would love to tell you that the satisfaction washed over me like a warm wave and that I slept easily with the confirmation pages on my nightstand, but what actually happened is that my stomach knotted and my hand shook a little when I set the alarm. Because there is a cost to doing the thing you always said you would do if pushed, and that cost is the silence that follows when the pushback runs out of steam, and while I stood in that silence, a courier knocked with an envelope from the bank, containing a hard copy of my withdrawal and a note from Mr. Green confirming the file had been reset to preliminary status, and behind that knock came another, heavier one that rattled the peephole and made me freeze. Because when I looked through the glass I saw not a neighbor with a package, but my father on the other side of my door, coatless, jaw set, phone in his hand like a baton. And before I could decide whether to speak or stay quiet, his knuckles hit the wood again, and he said my name. In that patient, dangerous way that means he thinks the conversation will end with me apologizing. And I stood there with a new filing receipt in one hand and the lock cold under the other and realized that the decision I made in the next minute would determine whether this stayed paperwork or turned into something much bigger. I stood there with my hand on the deadbolt and my name hanging on his lips like a verdict he expected me to accept, and in the long, heavy pause between one knock and the next I realized that opening the door would hand the conversation back to the old script where he raises his voice, I lower mine. He reframes the facts as feelings, and I end up doing the thing that makes the buzzing stop. So instead of turning the lock, I reached for the envelope I had prepared an hour earlier when the filing confirmation printed and the kettle clicked off, a plain letter that did not plead or posture but laid out, in words so clear they could be read aloud by anyone in any room, that I would not serve as guarantor on any obligation past, present, or future. That I had perfected a security interest arising from last year's bridge loan until repayment in full, that all lenders had been notified that any document bearing my name required my direct voice and my live signature, and that any further pressure would be forwarded to compliance and counsel without a returned call, after which I slid the envelope under the door, stepped back so he would not see my shadow, and waited for the paper to speak for me. He read quickly the way people do when they are looking for the trap and, not finding one, tried to invent it, and then he tried the old tones one by one through the wood, the tired leader tone about decades of sweat and sacrifice, the scolding coach tone about teams and unity, the careful father tone about how this was getting messy and neighbors talk, yet every phrase carried the same assumption that the role I owed him was usefulness without voice, and when I did not answer he tried the hard line about consequences and lost opportunities, and how a good daughter does not weaponize paperwork against her own family, at which point I reminded myself, out loud and quietly, That consequences were precisely what happens when people who are warned choose not to listen, and after a long silence, he said he would call me in the morning so we could fix this like adults, which sounded less like an invitation and more like a rehearsal of the part he was throwing away, and then his footsteps went down the hall while my phone began its steady jitter that told me the next phase had started. The first new voicemail was clipped and formal because he had obviously decided to perform for a possible audience, and he said he had just spoken with a private lender who was suddenly hesitant because my email had raised procedural questions, while the second message loosened around the edges and accused me of trying to humiliate him, and the third message, the one I played twice, finally delivered what I had been waiting to hear since I was old enough to understand the difference between inclusion and utility, because in a voice stripped of performance he admitted that I had been asked to sign because the bank liked me, not because he respected me, that the plan never involved me having a seat or a say, that I had always done what I was told and that had made me reliable, and that he had counted on that reliability more than he had ever said out loud, which is not an apology, but it is the truth, and truth has a way of moving air. While the message is stacked, the outside world did what it always does when light hits it, and the private lender replied to confirm they had paused their process in light of conflicting collateral claims and the withdrawal of the guarantor, while Mr. Green forwarded a clean confirmation that the bank file had been reset to preliminary status, with a note that any future underwriting would require updated financials and independent verification of all receivables, which is bureaucratic language. For start over without shortcuts, and as those emails settled into my inbox, I sent myself a copy of each one, because I have lived too long in a family where stories are edited in the retelling. Then I opened the group chat I had muted and typed a single line that was neither bitter nor baiting, telling them I would not be attending the reunion because I had heard the message loud and clear and would honor it. And then I closed the app before their responses could try to pull me back into a role I had outgrown. The next morning did not bring catharsis or fireworks. It brought a certified envelope from my father's attorney containing a proposed forbearance agreement that tried, in 5 pages of dense politeness, to coax me into releasing my security interest in exchange for nothing but a promise of future goodwill, and I returned it with a short, flat letter that attached the original promissory note. A simple payment schedule that converted what remained into equal monthly transfers to my account, until the balance closed, and a single condition that cost nothing and yet measured everything, which was that along with the first payment he would send a written statement addressed to the family acknowledging that calling me deadweight was not a joke or a slip. It was a habit, and that I had carried more than any of them ever admitted, and that my decision to protect my name was not betrayal, but overdue self-respect, and that no one in our house would, from that day forward, use my reliability as a leash. He did not answer for 2 days that felt like a slow walk across an old bridge everyone had sworn was sturdy, and then, just before the bank closed on the 3rd afternoon, a transfer hit my account with a memo line that simply named the old loan, followed an hour later by an email so plain it almost broke me because it did exactly what I asked without theater, saying he had called me deadweight and had used me as cover and had taught everyone else to see me as a tool instead of a person, that this was not leadership but laziness, that he did not expect forgiveness and would not ask for it again, and that he would make the remaining payments on time so that when the last one cleared I could release the lien and decide, on my terms, whether I ever wanted to sit at his table again. I did not reply because not replying was the point and the plan and the payoff, and I did not go to the reunion because attending would have turned the lesson back into a favor. And I did not gloat or post or parade because power that needs a parade is not power that lasts. I simply set a calendar reminder for each installment and a second reminder for the day I would file the release. And then I put my phone on silent and made dinner and listened to the quiet that comes when you are finally done auditioning for a part you never wanted, and as the evenings settled the voicemails kept arriving from a man who had finally met the version of me he should have met years ago, and while I will not pretend that the hurt vanished or that the future is simple, I can tell you that the ending feels like the final move in a game I refuse to play on their board, because I did not win by shouting or by burning anything down. I won by taking my name back and making them say it with respect, and that, in the only court that ever mattered to me, was epic.